I love this talk. Is about topics that we will address regarding your book. This talk is in the community spirit, so we would love as many of you to share your thoughts. If you have a comment, something you want to share, just raise your hand, and I will invite you to unmute, and then you can share. So anytime during the talk, we would love it to be in the community spirit. So let's get going. Patricia, you want to start by from the concept of walking through, walk us
Well,
through the.
even before we get into the content, right? And of course, there are always interesting parallels between training and treatment, right? We want to become fully present and engaged. So, especially people have gotten very used to being online. They've got other things popping up. They've got their phone on, right? And we're very distracted. And so I'd really like to invite everybody to shut down, their phone, shut down other pages or apps you've got, so that you can be fully present and engaged here in the conversation. I'd also really appreciate it if you would turn on your camera so we can actually see you. And again, instead of chatting away, right, which again is very distracting, unless you have an urgent matter that is technical and you need to get some information from Yuval, I would like you to save your comments and questions for, raise your hand and we'll have an actual conversation. Okay. So I think your question, Yuval, was, pretty open. Like, why did I even write this book? Right? I mean, I wrote 3 other books. Why do I write this book? And I think, again, not only as a clinician, but especially as a teacher, trainer, supervisor, I could see that, and especially, in Istdp, often the way it's taught, we're focusing a great deal on these big breakthroughs and a lot on the initial work, right? That initial trial therapy, getting the breakdown of defenses, the breakthrough of feeling, and then it's like done, as if that's the point, right? And yet that's just the beginning. And so I really thought we were missing a lot of very important, really key concepts involved in the actual working through of the patient's underlying conflicts. And that not only are they, abandoning defenses, but really starting to build in, healthy alternatives in how to relate to themselves and others. So that's really what prompted me to write the book, was to begin to discuss these other topics involved in the working through and also in termination and saying goodbye. Another thing we very rarely talk about in Istdp. And yet we know from research that it's this whole middle game, this whole that has the greatest impact on outcome. Right. So these are, I think, really important and yet neglected topics. And I have to say, I was shocked when I started to do research that there wasn't a single book, even in psychoanalysis, just devoted to the topic of working through. I mean, it's shocking, right? Given how important it is. So, yeah, I hope we can have a lively discussion about all the different elements involved.
Okay. So when I was starting to read the book, maybe I can share because I have it in the
Sure. Oh, please do.
Yeah, the online version. So, and of course, people, you are welcome to share thoughts, comments regarding the book. So I have a few things of my own. And chapter 1, from the beginning, when you go to the concept of working through. So I really like the idea about the integration between the cognitive part and the emotional part.
Right.
And here, when you wrote about research and clinical experience suggests that neither intellectual insight nor emotional catharsis alone is sufficient to promote deep and lasting change in symptoms and character disturbances. Change is a process, not a singular event. The work is multifaceted and requires us to help patients experience the feelings, wishes. So many tasks here. Experience the feelings, wishes, fantasies they have avoided, face painful and difficult truth, consolidate insight into a solid and coherent sense of self, examined distorted and pathological beliefs, and clearly understand the ways in which their internal conflict have been played out in relationship to others. The process through which defenses break down, anxiety-provoking feelings are faced and experienced, and insight is consolidated in such a way that enduring change is achieved has been termed working through. So I think this concept has so many in it. It really captures a lot of the work. And what spoke to me from the beginning is really this, what you actually highlight. So it's not about just, getting to feelings, but really make the patient the expert of his process. So how he's understanding the process cognitively. And of course, we can't do anything if he won't experience his feelings, but this integration between the cognitive and the emotional part. So the beginning of the book really.
Right. So getting the head and heart talking to each other. Right. Yeah. So at least in the United States, most of the patients we're treating have entrenched character disorders. They're not just anxious and depressed, right? But they tend to have this histrionic character or an obsessional character. And we know that unless you tackle the character defenses, even if you get change in symptoms during treatment, it's very likely the patient will relapse. And so it's these really ingrained automatic patterns that are so common in these character disorders that really take a lot of this working through, right? That again, neither the insight alone nor the emotion, we need both, right? So we definitely have to connect these two. And the other one that we have to connect is relationship to self and relationship to other, right? So I'll often say, well, it's really between you and you, right? You want to make it between you and me, right? Patients will often have conflicts with other people, right? Rather than facing and tolerating their own internal conflict. So again, already you can start to see the complexity involved, right? And the different levels at which you need to intervene. Yeah.
Okay, so people, you have thoughts, comments, you're welcome. Unless, if you want to have comments, so you will have to listen to me too much. So so I will go on with my next one until you will get into it.
We have a couple ways to approach it, right, Yuval? I mean, we can either sort of take it chapter by chapter, right? Or if there are particular cases that you had questions about or that struck you, but we might want to be somewhat systematic, right, in how we approach it, and then we can open it up. Yeah,
we will structure with flexibility. We will.
There you go. Right.
We will combine it. Okay, so what struck with me, chapter 2, talking about walking through in the initial contact, and the first case with the man in the cave. So maybe I will share it and we can see it. as we're
Oh, the
talking
man in the
about it.
cave.
Yes, I love this case.
Yeah, he was interesting. And he, like many, right, had had a previous, I mean, not only, of course, he had had several other therapies in his life, but it also had an ISTDP therapy when this most recent depression hit. And he actually had quite a bad experience and felt much worse. And unfortunately, you know, we've all heard this, right? So again, we need to learn from that, like what goes wrong there, right? And then how did I, you know, approach him differently in such a way that we were able to get a good outcome. Yeah. So what was your question about?
So yeah, about the initial contact. So another thing is the book is so clear. So you know, so I really want to highlight, I think, for for this talk and for us, for the therapists, for the community, the thing about the initial contact. So I think it's very important because a lot of the times, we don't make it on the first session, that we miss things, we miss patterns, right? Maybe we have misalliance, we have ruptures. So, but we can do it. We can repair. Goes to ruptures and repair. We can repair along the way in any initial contact. So this is why I like this, getting into the first thing is to emphasize the topic about here. It is essential that we discover the correct precipitant to the patient's suffering, even if it has been lifelong. Why is the patient seeking help now? And this is where you start. So I love that, you start there. And when he's telling you about other, the bad treatment that he had, and he tells you about you gather the data. So you stay on why now. So you don't go along with, you don't even ask for, which you can, you don't ask for feelings for the other therapist that went wrong there. You say, yeah, but why do you come and see me? So can you, say more about the importance of this initial contact in the first session, but in every session, actually. Also on your YouTube channel, you talk about how to start sessions.
Right, which is basically not to start them, right? So the only session we would start really is the first, right? Tell me why you're here and how I can help. This is dynamic psychotherapy. So we're hoping, right, that you give yourself enough time, 2 to 3 hours for that initial contact. So you have some hope, right, of getting through the central dynamic sequence. And it was designed this way. So if you start with that intensity and you're actually able to facilitate a therapeutic experience in that first session, it really catapults the whole treatment forward. It greatly increases the conscious and unconscious alliance. So when people try to practice ISTDP in a way that is contrary to how it was designed, right? They see people for an initial 50 minutes or 90 minutes, right? And then they wonder why they never get there, right? They sort of have to repeat they get stuck in defenses and never get below it. So I really advocate, I'm sort of an old-fashioned ISTDP therapist. I do that 3-hour initial, and we always start with the current. That's something that Davinlo really focused on. We do not start with an exploration of the past. We want to know why the patient is there now. This is where their pain is, and this is where their motivation is. And as long as you can get the inquiry, right, the information, he's got anxiety and depression. Turns out, he also has some relationship problems. So I want to get details about that. What's the nature of these problems? When did they start? What's the pattern, right? And we want to get, as long as we can gather that information, you want to do so, right? The only time you're going to skip over that and start asking for feelings or dealing with defenses is when the person comes into the session with what we might call ready-made transference feelings, right? They've been to lots of therapists before, right? They're really maybe even there against their will. Somebody else is forcing them. They come in with their arms. Oh, geez, what, who are you anyway, right? How are you going to help? I don't know, right? So in those cases, you have to take up what's happening here and now with you, right? To clear a space, right? But in most cases, I would say easily 80% of the cases, right? You're going to start with, why are you here now? Right? What is your current suffering? When did that start? And you're going to begin to get this agreement. So remember, we're always dealing with the twin forces, defense and resistance on the one hand, but we're really there to build an alliance, right? Conscious and unconscious that's going to be stronger. So too often, again, people start jumping in and dealing with defenses before they've created any kind of alliance or agreement. So, you want to really agree about, so is this the problem then? And very often you'll find me repeating back to the patient what I really listen, which is another thing I find many ISTDP therapists are not good at. They literally don't listen to the patient. They're so busy intervening, right, and thinking that it's their brilliant intervention, right, and they're missing what the person is actually saying. So I really listen, and then I'll repeat back. So is this what you're saying then, right? So ever since mother died, right, you've been in this depression, is that right? And then, of course, you're here to get to the bottom of that, to resolve that. And if you could, what would the goal be? Right. So we don't just want a negative goal. I don't want to be depressed anymore.
Right.
Right. But what do you want? Right. I want to be actively engaged. I want to, find work that I love, things like that. And then the third aspect, right, of the conscious alliance is
so important, the conscious alliance.
Right. And it's then that agreement on the task, the therapeutic task. What are we going to do together? How are we going to get from where you're stuck in this problem to that goal? And this is most often missing in most therapies. And in fact, research suggests that patients and therapists have very different ideas about what is going to be required. So again, this may seem cognitive in a sense, right? But I really focus on this agreement, right? So is this what we're agreeing to then, right? And then what we're already seeing is, right, this pattern in which you get depressed following a conflict, right? And it's looking like, you suppress your anger and get depressed instead. Is it right? So then are we agreeing? So here's the task that we would want to help you face rather than avoid that feeling. Is that right? Right. So again, I'm really intent on getting these conscious agreements, and it really makes the process go much more smoothly. Yeah.
And this is so you talked about the twin factors. So in this case, the man in the cave, so he's coming with all sort of well, there are signals from the beginning. So he sighs and he say that he's trapped, and he's talking about the other therapist, that he had a bad experience, and he's giving examples from he met this guy and he got defended and had trouble communicating with him. And then you are talking about the as you use the guide of response to intervention, so the pattern behavior in the transference. So then you address the topic about emotional closeness. So, and this is just 2-3 minutes into the session. So
yes. So this is again why, even though some talk about having an algorithm and very technical, there really is no way to create some template about how you always proceed, right? So I start, right, with this inquiry, and I'm getting an idea he has, anxiety and depression. And he offers up, although I think he stopped in the middle. He said, I saw another therapist, and and then he doesn't finish his sentence.
Yeah, and then you go,
Right?
what
And
you're
I
going
say,
to
well,
say?
what were you going to say? And he said, gosh, it was bad. I mean, he trampled all
Yeah.
over me. What happened, right? So already
And,
now
and
I'm
this
getting
and this can be missed. You see,
totally
what you're going to say? See, this just
right.
genuine
Right.
communication. What there is something you're going to say. What were you going to say? Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
You listen, right? And that's important. If someone suddenly, right, they're saying something and they stop,
Probably
right? There's
important.
they're
Yeah,
holding
it's
back,
important.
right?
Important. Yeah.
And that's super important because now he's starting with, well, I have these problems. I went for help before, but gee, not only did I not get help, I got trampled on. So, in a sense, his unconscious is bringing the transference, right? So, first, I want to find out what happened. He tells me, and I acknowledge, I say, that's terrible,
Right. Right.
right? Which it is. You
Right.
go for help and somebody, that's terrible. But then I'm also noticing that he's not looking at me when he talks,
Right.
right? So this is where you're keeping lots of balls in the air. He brings up this previous experience, and then I notice a certain distance that he's keeping from me.
Here you say
So it's
interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
very
When I talk.
I say, when I talk, you look at me. But when you talk, you look away and disconnect. Now, talk about response to intervention. He starts crying.
Right.
And then reveals that this is not only in therapy that it's a problem, that he gives a couple other examples where someone was available for close, direct contact, and he got anxious and moved away. So this is an excellent response to intervention, right? You don't usually, right?
Right.
But again, if you strike while the iron is hot. So the fact that both he had an emotional reaction, right, and is sad, upset about his tendency to withdraw, that tells you his defenses are what? Syntonic or dystonic already.
Yeah, it started to turn against his defenses.
Right. I mean, he's already not just seeing, and he can, that's number two, he spontaneously gives other examples.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if he just
Right.
said, oh, yeah, I see, that's a problem. Right.
Yeah. Right.
He has emotional reaction and he spontaneously brings up other examples. So he's already, right, starting to turn on those defenses, right,
Yeah.
which is really positive. So, and then really looking at, again, the effect of that. I say, and you must be lonely, right? And he says, yes, very lonely and afraid. And he starts to cry again, right? So then I respond by intensifying his conflict, right? So he wants help. In order to get help, you have to open up, but he's afraid to open up, right? And is keeping a certain distance. So again, I'm not challenging, I'm not doing a head-on collision, but
right.
I say, boy, it's going to be a dilemma here, right? Because on the one hand, you're lonely and you want the contact. On the other hand, you're afraid and keep a distance. So this is really what Istdp is about, the way I see it, which is really identifying and then intensifying those conflicts.
Right.
Now, again, this was something he showed me. He didn't tell me. He told me he had anxiety and depression. But I was watching, right, as he told me, I went for help before, I got trampled. So it was only because I brought up in the here and now, right, that he was keeping a distance, that he then said, yeah, I have this problem, right, in my life. Now, he might not have mentioned that, right? So this is...
What time did you say it was? 11? What time do we...
Yeah. Maybe, yeah, people need... So, you know, Alan calls it listening with your eyes. Right? So we want to keep our eye on what's happening. And again, I think it showed, you know, to bring to consciousness what the patient is showing that they can't tell us. Yeah.
And this is, yeah, you mentioned the twin factors. And I think, you know, when we can get into trouble when we focus on like a split process, we focus on the alliance too much, we don't address resistance, or a lot of the time in Istdp, we focus too much on the defenses, on the resistance, and then when we do that, so actually the defenses are working, and defenses are working in a way because patients are coming in with their defenses, so they are working all over their life. So when we are addressing just this part, so actually we got hooked in the defense.
Right. So you don't want to just do one or the other. It's the conflict, right, between these two forces, right, that you really want to bring to light and intensify, right, until the person shifts or until they choose, right, which way to go.
So what? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering if anybody else has questions about this first chapter. How to facilitate, because we often think of working through as the middle phase of therapy, right? Beginning, middle, end. And of course, we do have that. But in a sense, each session has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so I'm working through from the start, right? I'm not just going for defenses and breakthrough, right? I'm elucidating the pattern so the person is cognitively clear at the same time that they're getting emotionally, right, activated. So that's my 1-2 punch. I tend to, do you experience that? Do you see it? Do you understand, right? I want both online.
Yeah.
Yeah. So does anybody else, I hope people have read the book. Does anybody have a question about this working through from the start or perhaps from the case? Or do I have more than one case? Let's see. I haven't read it. The errant priest also.
Yeah.
Oh, he's really interesting. But okay, so are there any hands up? Is anyone going to take a
courage
stab at? You learn better by being actively involved, folks.
Yeah, there is so much to talk about in the initial contact, the phases of every session, you know.
Yeah. Because again, you never know. There's no guarantee you're going to be able to see this person again. You might plan to, right? But
we have a hand.
Anything can happen. So we want to optimize the contact in each situation. Okay, who have we got?
Hi.
I'd like to talk.
Hi.
Hi, Patricia. I'm just in the middle of reading one of your books, this one. Okay, and I find it very interesting indeed. So my first question is, what's the difference, the main difference between this book and the new one we're talking about? And the next question is silly and easy, maybe. You've just mentioned the fact that the first meeting with the patient ought to be around 3 hours.
Right.
First of all, do you charge for 3 hours? And if so,
yes, I do.
Yes, you do, and they're ready to pay for 3 hours. Okay.
I do. Yes.
And is it right? And every second session, every following session is also as many hours as needed, or just 1 hour?
No. So it sounds like you're new to ISTDP. Is that right?
All right. Yes.
Yes. So we do things a little bit differently. And I say that right on the phone. If someone calls, I'll say, I work a little differently, so let me tell you, right? First of all, I do an intensive 3-hour initial session with a follow-up within a couple of days and no more than a week, because I also really need to see how the person deals, right, with the material, because it's intense in that first session, and how they're able to understand it and metabolize it is important. And then I also tell them that I videotape everything. And so they, I'll send them a form for that. And when I first started practicing, I was still taking insurance, and insurance won't cover more than 1 unit per day. And so at that point, I thought, I don't care. So I was willing, right, just to take the payment for the 1 session, but to do the 3-hour, okay? And I would tend to do that on a Friday morning, and then I wouldn't work in the afternoon. So I would also review the case, write it up, and that's very, very important. So I get a really clear case formulation in my mind, right, after that initial. But, so much of this has to do with your own conviction about the work. So when you're on the phone and you say, this is the way I work, it's 3 hours, I videotape, I very rarely get a no, very rarely. And yet a lot of my trainees do, and it's because, they're tentative, right? They'll say, well, maybe if or in one case recently, the patient had agreed to videotaping. And then when the patient came in, he asked again and said, well, are you sure? And then the guy said, well, maybe not, because, right. So there's something about, therapists who are passionate about what they're doing, right, and believe in it, right, that has an impact too. So just briefly, your other question, my first book really was a primer. It's a basic book outlining the method from start to finish, to some extent from inquiry to termination. But again, it's a beginner's guide. And this one is much more specifically about working through, and again, with complex cases where there are many factors involved. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for the question. Ruth. Just unmute.
Yeah.
Hi.
I'd like to ask, I must confess that I haven't read the book yet, so maybe we talk about it more. I do have it, but we just had a quick look. But I have a question, especially about this concept of working through, because I have two, let's say, types of patients that are for a very long time in therapy. One is therapists themselves, so people who really want to explore their lives and they want a therapist to accompany them for a long time. And the other type is people with character, let's say with personality disorders or character disorders. And they really need someone to follow them, sometimes for a very long time, sometimes for a period, and then they terminate therapy, or they don't really terminate, they stop or have a break, and they can come after 2 years or 3 years again because they have something new. And I feel with these people that we have this initial phase that during the inquiry, I do kind of Istdp, EDT, what I do. And then we have some unlocking and some breakthroughs, and we work on the defenses, but after a while, we're kind of on a safe ground, and we continue therapy because we already moved over this phase. And then I continue doing something which is, sometimes we have to facilitate it more, but we continue a kind of more like dynamic therapy, which is not exactly, we don't have any more major unlockings or we kind of, it's a different phase. And I would like to know what you think about it, or what is your views?
Yeah. Again, in traditional ISTDP, we're trying to do, as Sullivan said, as much with as little as possible. People are really suffering. The people around them are suffering. And so having some pressure and challenge is really important to keep the process moving and not to flatten out like that in the middle. It's very important when you're talking about brain change and behavior change in adults, you need safety and challenge. And so I think a lot of therapists err too far on the safety, right? They're this safe place and so on. And there's not enough challenge for the person to really change. And so I think if you realize you're starting to flatten out, right, then you need to wonder what's going on there. My guess, having worked with you a little bit, is that you're avoiding the transference, right? So something's going on in the transference pattern. They're maybe wanting to hold on to you, right? And start to delay, right? So they can.
But I'm not talking about something like that. I'm talking about a therapy which is successful. People had some major change and they're feeling good. Okay. But they still want to be in therapy. Either they need it because they need constant support.
But why? Right? So this really would be the question. I'm always asking why. So if they've done so well, why do they need to keep coming to therapy?
Either they're therapists and they want someone to accompany them, and then they don't have any major issues, but they want to be in therapy because it's part of their taking care of themselves. But this is not so important. I think the other case is more interesting for me. People who have some character disorders, personality disorders, and they don't have enough ego strength or capacity to take care of themselves by themselves. Right? They need therapists to.
Why not? Right? Because why not? I mean, we have a lot of ways of increasing ego adaptive capacity pretty quickly, right? So one thing that's very different in ISTDP than other traditional dynamic therapies is we're really focusing on the internal life of the patient, increasing the patient's capacity to tolerate feelings, to tolerate ambivalence, right? Rather than we are kind of doing that for them, right? So we don't want them depending on us to do what they can actually do. These ego facilities, ego adaptive capacity, observing ego, becoming aware of anxiety and being able to regulate it. This is an inside job, right? So you don't want to be doing that for them and keeping them dependent on you. This very often happens and you become the most important person in their life. So I'm also always very attentive to what's happening in their outside relationships, right? To make sure that I'm not the only person they're opening up to, but they're taking this newfound ability, right, to be authentic and, into other. So again, we have to be specific, Ruth. It's hard to talk in general terms. But what the research has found in ISTDP is that character disorders generally can be treated in 20 to 40 sessions, right? So for people who are more neurotic, often 0 to 10, 0 to 20, character disorders 20 to 40, and more fragile 40 to 60, even up to 100, right? But we're really trying to build capacity so the patients can do these functions for themselves. Okay. So again, if you have like a specific case, or unfortunately, like if we could look at a case in the book or something like that, because I think general discussions are not as helpful. So, okay, Yo. Thanks, Ruth. Unmute yourself, Yop, so we can hear you.
It's great to see you again, and it brings back
it's wonderful.
very good memories of our training.
Copenhagen.
I've read the book, and as the previous books, they are really so stimulating and give such a lot of food for thought. I have a question which I will relate to a very specific case, but the question is more. I see a patient now for 3 years who has been in classical psychoanalysis for 20 years, 5 days a week, almost 20 years, which was a very traumatic therapy for her. I won't go into details. I started with her in the classical Istdp way, and I see her twice a week. If it was up to her, she again would want to see me maybe 3, 4, 5 times a week. Now, my question is this. Working through relates to what's happening in therapy. But I wonder, what are your both expectations, ideas, but also what's happening in between sessions? So if I take the concept of working through, what would you hope happens after a session ends and before the next session? What do you hope? And what is your experience? What does happen in between?
Yeah.
And how do we affect that? And I ask you that in particular because I have a difficult time with her, because there's a lot of pressure on me to give her more therapy. If it was up to her, she would want to talk to me maybe more times a week on the telephone, half an hour here, half an hour there.
So what's the problem she's showing you?
She has a very, I hope I understand the question. She had a very traumatic childhood with parents who verbally abused her. And she came back to therapy.
Okay, but what does this have to do, right, with why she is wanting to be so dependent on you and talking to you all the time, and right? So it may be that this, especially someone who's been in 5 times a week analysis for 20 years, you want to head this off at the pass, right? And say, so you have this tendency to become extremely dependent on others, rather than to stand on your own 2 feet. Is that right?
Yes.
So
absolutely.
would that be a goal of yours then, right? Because you can actually have a collusive alliance in therapy. It's not just about, a therapeutic alliance or not, right? Often therapists can collude unconsciously, right, with their patients' defenses, and colluding with a dependent patient, right, by doing too much for them is one of those dangers. So I think really talking to her about this, and how is this in her best interest, and what does she really want for herself, right? And does she want to have both a really solid relationship with herself and also with real people in her life?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
Can you say a few words about what you expect or what you find happens in between sessions in terms of working through what happened in the session?
Yes, because of course, working through does not just happen in therapy, right? The whole point is that their conflicts are being worked through, right? So that those old destructive patterns are being broken up, replaced with something healthy. And you're going to want to see that in the next session, right? They've had a different experience, for example, right? So even though I don't give homework or anything like that, but I'm working very intensely in the session. We're very clear about our goals, right, as well as the problems. And so when you're working to, again, get through defenses, get to feelings, it really strengthens the conscious and unconscious alliance. So the patient is highly motivated. So almost always, someone will come in the next session and say, wow, I had a really new experience in this past week. I'm remembering one man, I think I talked about him in my last book, where he had a very passive, subservient, dependent, really a masochistic character style. And other therapists had somehow fallen into, playing this out in sort of a dominant, submissive way, right? And he was addicted to pornography that was all about dominance and submission. But this showed up in every aspect of his life. And I picked it up in the transference, how he would say, oh, but you would know, doc, not me. And I'd say, wait a minute, look at what's happening here, right? So really head that off at the pass. And so even though I didn't, and I could tell, and he even said, when I asked him something about how he was responding to me, he said, no mixed feelings, doc. I mean, I don't have any mixed feelings, right? But I said, but clearly you do. No, he says, no, I've learned more from you in 17 minutes than I had for 7 years in my last therapy. So he really was only conscious of the positive feelings. So I wasn't going to hit him over the head. I certainly remembered it. I tried a couple other times. No, he denied it. But, we were still working on his patterns. He comes back for the next session and said that he had a huge breakthrough after the session. Because again, he was always Mr. Submissive, right? So I was really working on turning him on that defense. And so he was a lawyer. He got into an elevator with a judge. And this was a judge who was pretty famous. He was just in the newspaper. And he said, boy, in the past, I never would have said a word. But I said, hey, aren't you so-and-so? Aren't you? I'm, Patricia Coughlin, nice to meet you. He said, I never would have done that in a million years, and then he was so proud of himself. And so after that, and I said, wow, that's great, and then he said, and by the way, I do have to say that I was actually rather annoyed with you the last time because, right? So a huge amount happened, right? Tons of stuff happens in between. And if it isn't, right, and someone's like, oh yeah, like, what did we talk about last time? Or, then they're really in resistance, and that's what we would have to tackle. Yeah, but I find that patients do a whole lot in between sessions, and I would expect that, even though, I don't assign homework or anything. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, very much, and suddenly I got a new insight, which I will absolutely immediately apply in my next session, because of something what you said about how she really, suddenly it hits me, yes, how she really repeats with me something that actually existed and still exists between her and her abusive father.
Exactly. And also, like with her past analysis, right, might blame the analyst, right? But now you can see what she's doing. So that reminds me of Phoenix Rising, who I wrote about also in my last book. She had been in analysis 4 times a week for 10 or 12 years. And again, had only gotten worse over time. And so then she came to me for a block therapy, and she was complaining that, the analyst was so unresponsive, that while on the one hand, he kept telling her that she needed to depend on him and open up when she did, and she'd cry, like he wouldn't say anything, and she'd just lie there by herself, right? So you think, well, isn't that terrible, right? So here I am, and I'm offering her, and she's the one now keeping a distance, right? She's not looking at me. Her affect is flat. And so then I pointed out, I said, you're kind of, blaming the analyst, right, for not being present and engaged in your, here, I'm fully engaged. I'm inviting you. You're the one holding back. Do you see that? You're the one, because she's saying, oh, he wouldn't look at me and I wanted to sit up. And he said, I had to lie. I said, but who's disconnecting now? She's like, oh, yeah, me. Okay. Right. So that stuff is really important. Yeah. You'll have to drop me a note and let me know how it goes.
I'll do so. Thank you very much for your reaction.
Thanks. Oh, it's always great. Okay, Melissa.
Hi, Patricia. Thank you so much for the clarity of your writing in this book and your other books. I find them super helpful. I find that when I read your cases, I am always so surprised at how willing people are to give up their defense almost, right? Like even in this case that we were just talking about, where there's sort of both parts of him not wanting to open up. And then right away he says, I'm going to tell you something and I'm going to try to look at you as I tell you. Like right away, he's dropped his defense. And it's like, and I find that as I go along, so I wonder, okay, is there more defense work going on outside of the snippets that I read, or is your defense work just so strong that you don't have to keep on the defense and keep turning people against their resistant systems? Because I find that it's a continual sort of struggle.
Okay, that's a really good question. So I think that there are a couple things with that first man. He was in a crisis, right? He was acutely depressed. He had flown from another country to see me for this intensive. He was highly motivated. I mean, this guy was super responsive, okay? So it's not, and given that, I mean, he was for the last therapy too, and it went poorly, right? Because that therapist was just jumping all over him, right? And hadn't built the alliance at the same time. So I think there are, of course, many factors involved, but doing the defense work thoroughly. So very often we'll just point it out, like, do you see that you're smiling? Right, but that's not funny. So could we look, right? But I will identify it, clarify it, have him look at the consequences and stay there like, wow, you must be lonely then, right? And so it's going through the whole sequence so the patient really feels the cost, right? If it's too cognitive or they haven't really turned on it, and especially if a patient is compliant and they'll say, oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. And I'll say, okay, so say it back to me. What are you seeing? And what's another example? Is it just here? Right? So there's something about being thorough in that and making sure the patient turns on the defense before you go to feeling, right? I see people kind of rush that process and they somehow think if they get to feeling, then the defenses will just drop off, but they often don't. So I think it's about being really thorough. So again, that fellow was very responsive, but the next guy, the errant priest, right, even though it seemed like we got off to a great, I mean, we did have a good first session for sure, but he was super resistant. And then it was one after the other. That's the other thing you'll see, right? They'll drop passivity, then become defiant, right? Then become, so again, it all depends on the case. Yeah. Okay. But really make sure you spend some time turning the patient. I don't go to feeling until they've said kind of, I've had it with this. Right.
That makes a lot of sense.
I'm depressed. Right. So, and then motivated to look at the feelings.
Yeah. And like in the case of the man who couldn't stop shaking, you were pointing out that sort of the anxiety comes with certain triggers, like being with you. And so how does he feel? And he takes a big sigh. And then he says it makes logical sense, but it's not resonating. And so you don't continue to go for feeling. You're like, okay, well, tell me more. Tell me about your hypothesis then. And so you're then fleshing out the resistance rather than sticking on the feeling. Okay, that's helpful.
Exactly. Yeah. And that guy came in, with very high resistance in that session. And also he was like, when I was sort of pointing out, and that's the other thing, like I'm pointing out the negative consequences, right, of his defense. And he's like, and I said, wouldn't you agree, that this is really destructive? And he said, all right, you want me to agree? I'll agree.
Yeah.
I'm like, no. I don't want you going along with me. I really mean it. Do you see this? So that's the other thing I find, that asking the patient rather than telling them, we're so anxious to point it all out, but to ask, well, what happens then? Because they'll say, well, listen, if I shut down and withdraw, I'm safe then, right? And nobody can hurt. I say, yeah, that's true, right? So there's a benefit there. But what's the cost? Right? What's the consequence of that? So ask them, because if they say, well, I just end up alone, I'm really sad, that's more powerful than just agreeing with what you've said. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Laura.
Yes. Hello, Patricia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I also read your book, and it's really helpful. And with working through, I am struggling so much at this moment with my own defenses as a therapist, because I am still in core training, and I'm getting a bit better at my defense work. But now feelings in the transference are rising, and my anxiety gets up. My own anxiety gets up. And I was wondering maybe if you have some thoughts that can help, because now I'm just writing down and repeating in myself what I should say, but I'm wondering.
So again, it's not just about what you should say. I mean, I think, I have a certain problem with some of the skill training, because I think you have to really understand the process, find your own words, use the patient's own words. Daphne used to say that we can overemphasize countertransference, right? That it's our defenses, it's our anxiety. It's not to say that we don't have it, but he said, until you really understand the method and you know how to use it, right, you can't necessarily attribute the problem to your own difficulties, right? When I can really see that is when the therapist knows darn well what they should be doing and they're not doing it, right? So it's often a mix. But I think are you asking about how to deal with your own anxiety about going into the transference?
Yes, because I'm addressing like resistance to emotional closeness. Yeah. And then she's like getting vague or saying words like maybe or looking away. And when I address it, tension goes up. And also my own tension gets up, because it's like I'm afraid that I don't know where we'll go. Like I think I'm afraid of a confrontation, like
sure, or a misalliance or something, right? Because often, therapists go in, what are you feeling toward me? And the patient's going, I don't know, I don't have any feelings towards you. What, because they haven't been clear about what they're actually seeing that lets them know there is a feeling there. So a couple things I think are really important. So the research suggests that working in the transference is dicey, right? It can make it go really well or poorly, right? So it's kind of a risky strategy, and you have to know when and how to use it. it's most effective when you first point out and get an agreement that the patient has a problem in their life, in relationships. So you could reiterate. So from what you've told me, right, you have a lot of trouble in relationships. You're lonely, you want closeness, but then you get scared, right? And, you know, you break appointments, you don't go out, whatever, okay? So you have to make sure that the patient already sees they have a problem in relationship.
The clarification.
Yes, and then make the link. So they have to see they have a problem in the current, right? On the triangle of person, right? They're having a current problem in relationships. And then you say, and this is a classic bridge, right, that I learned from Tavenlow. I say, so then if you look to how you interact here with me, I think we can already begin to see the same pattern.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you want help, right? And you can also give them credit, like you give me a lot of data, right? I mean, and yet at the same time, you're kind of emotionally shut down, right? Your voice is a monotone. You look away, your arms are crossed. Do you see what I mean? Right? So you don't want to be first you're just going to acquaint them. Do they see that the same pattern that's in their life is showing up there with you? And then again, I would stay with the effect of those defenses. I wouldn't rush to what do you feel toward me? Right? But okay, so we have to look at what's going to happen here. As long as you keep this emotional distance, right? And what's going to happen to your goals? What's going to happen to our process? So they have to say, well, it's going to undermine it actually. Right? So there's some kind of destructive process then, right? It's like you're working across purposes. Consciously you want it, but unconsciously we see there's a part of you, right? And often, again, I'll even use humor. I'll say, yeah, like you're going to be damned if you're going to let me in, right? Like, right? So again, that's, I think, what Yuval was talking about, that I'm conversational. I use, I'm not just using clinical terms, right? So I think those talk about the problem they're there to address, their problem in relationships, and then do the bridge, right? Do you see how that same pattern is showing up here? And what's going to happen as long as you keep your emotional distance here from me? What's going to happen to our process? What's going to happen to your goal? Right? And is that what you want? Yeah. Or are you willing? So that's the other thing that I do, is that instead of sort of, asking someone, where's your will? And sort of pull yourself up by, I'll say, are you willing to open up here? Right? Are you willing to give this a try to see where we can go? I find people are very responsive to that question. Yeah. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, it helps a lot, especially the asking instead of telling them what the price is. Telling them. Yeah.
Right. Because otherwise you won't know that they've really got it.
Yeah.
It's easy for people just to agree with you or go along, but you really have to make sure they've got to say, okay, so give me a recent example. And you'll see if they can or not.
Yeah, and then you don't get into the compliance. Yeah, thank you so much.
Exactly. Oh, terrific. Thanks. So Yuval, maybe we can get back to some other, because there's so many other topics, multiple causation and autonomy and attachment, things again that we don't talk about.
So I think Melissa spoke about autonomy and attachment with the man who was shaking when you actually highlight his autonomy with not agreeing with you. I think this was great. And this thing about, in Istdp, but in every therapy. So patients need to have their autonomy.
Absolutely.
Really feel good with their autonomy, so they will have a good attachment. So when it's showing up in the therapy session, we need to highlight that. So I think this is what you did there. This is what Melissa talked about there. So I think it's so important. It happened a lot in sessions when, John says it a lot, when the first task in therapy is that the patient will tell you no.
Well, unfortunately,
set a boundary. So we can highlight it, okay, as a.
You mean the first healthy attempt? Because most of our patients are saying yes too much, in my experience.
Yeah, there's yes to what? Yeah, yes to what?
Right?
But they say no to really open up. So, so we can, anyway, let's not get into that.
Right, I think it's two different things. So let's talk about it, because I don't know anybody else in the community that talks about these two drives, right? Which we know exist in human beings from birth until death, right? One, of course, is to attach. And I think that we have overemphasized attachment as if it is the one and only need that human beings have.
Right.
But we have a parallel track with an equal need to be separate, to be self-defined, self-directed, and autonomous. And it's getting these two in balance that is really a lifelong task. Most of our patients sacrifice one core need for the other. I will give up myself to hold on to you. And this is what might be happening with your case, Joop, right? Where this woman is, right, she gives up herself just to hold on to others. And of course, the more she depends on others, the more anxious she's going to become, right? Because she can't control that, right? So helping her hold on to herself is going to be a real goal. But you have, and I talk about these guys, right, in later chapters, more narcissistic characters who screw you, I got to be me. Okay, all that matters is what they feel, what they want. They trample over people. And they are, of course, much more difficult to treat and rarely self-refer, right? It's the people around them that are referring them. So again, it's how we need to sort of diagnose, right, which need is being sacrificed to get those back on equal footing, right? And that's really going to affect how you intervene. So if you have a patient, again, who's very subservient, compliant, that they're constantly giving themselves up for others, right? When they say yes to you, again, you want to just question it. Are you just agreeing with me?
Right.
Or that's what you really think, right?
Yeah.
And then they really get that and turn on it. Again, I'm thinking about the woman I call the woman under the influence, who again had a very masochistic character. And when she really got it, I remember her coming into a session after, and she said, now every single time I ask myself, Nancy, are you just offering yourself up on a platter? Is that what you really, are you giving yourself up right now? Or is that what you really want? And I say, no, it's, I've got something in me, right? So that's really important. And you can miss that, right? If you're just focusing on attachment and, and not enough also on their autonomy.
Right. Yeah. And also attachment trauma. So if a person have an attachment trauma, so it will make sense. He will, on the one hand, you need, of course, this is something that is missing in your life, but on the other hand, he didn't have his own self. So we need to address that. So yeah, it's really important. And I think in all psychotherapy, because there is a big focus about attachment, but autonomy, you need also.
Right. Yeah. And get them in balance so that, because I'll often say, and you'll see this with patients where, again, you're talking, they'll listen. And then when they go to respond, right, they break off and maybe go to their head. And I'll point that out and they'll say, well, I seem to have to break contact with you to get in touch with me. So they're letting you know then. I say, okay, So that's the way it is now. But would you say, right, that the goal is to be able to hold on to yourself in close contact with another, so that you don't have to choose, I can either be with me or with you, right? That you get to the place where you can do both. And they'll say, oh, yeah, that
sounds good. Yeah.
Because it's a problem for lots of people. Yeah. Do you have a question about this, Evelyn?
Yeah, I wanted to elaborate that a little deeper, because I think, let me try to think here, how it's so easy, even just starting to do so much Istdp, to see any ways that we want to maintain a distance from somebody as a resistance against emotional closeness, like when looking at things in the sea. And there are times when, like, because I've been thinking, what's the logical conclusion of all of that? Is it that we're supposed to be close with everybody? And but then the only way I've been able to conceptualize it is, oh, I don't want to be close, I'm angry at them, right? Feel your anger. And so sometimes, but we're not always angry at someone, we just don't want to be close to them. And so how do you think of holding on to yourself? Does that make sense in relationships, aside from going, I don't like?
Yeah, I don't think it's just about feelings or anger, right? That for people who, once they're looking at you, can kind of merge, they literally lose themselves in the other, right? So it's not just about feelings, right? So if you sense that or can identify that, and they'll say, yeah, that's what happens all the time. I kind of leave myself behind. It becomes all about the other person. Right. I'll say that's a problem then, right? And you want to be, so at first, then they might say, well, to get in touch with me, I do have to break eye contact with you, because otherwise I'm so focused, like on your face and what do you want? So as an intro step, it's like, okay, let them do that. Right? It's not, that's why understanding the case, and like you're saying, not just seeing that as a defense against emotional closeness, but as an attempt to get in touch with the self.
Oh, that's interesting, because already when you were talking, I was thinking of, is that compliance or identifying with the other, like using these phrases to capture defense, like, because I've certainly had many clients who do that, right? And they get so absorbed in you and meeting their need. But then I'm thinking of it in my mind, like they're trying to please, that is all happening. But
well, not even necessarily. Okay. Not even just to please. So let's say you were raised in a very chaotic home, right? With a very labile mother and an alcoholic father. I mean, you have your radar out. You don't have the luxury, right, of connecting to yourself. And, it's like, as soon as dad comes home, you better figure out, what state he's in so you can, right? I mean, so this is why you have to understand the whole person and have a case formulation for the why. Why is this person right having to either be so preoccupied with the other, right, so detached from the self? So it's only once you understand the why that you're really going to know how to intervene.
Well, and I'm still trying to, this is great to hear the why, because I notice how, because of the way I've been training, my mind then wants to reduce it to say, they're hypervigilant. Oh, that's identification with the aggressor. Like all these different ways I want to piece out the defensive aspect of that relational dynamic, even when I know the history of.
Okay, but listen to what you're saying. You're supervising yourself, right? So you're saying, and the danger is that you're going to be reductionistic, as if everything is just about defense against feeling toward the other, right? That's very, very reductionistic, and things are much more complicated than that. And that's the whole point of this book.
Okay. Okay.
To look, and also to look at the multiple functions, right, that any one symptom might have, right? So on the one hand, right, it could be a defense against closeness. On another hand, right, it could be a way to hold on to the self. On the other hand, do you know what I mean? So we have to be able to tolerate that complexity.
Okay.
Right, and not try to, again, break people into pieces, right? But to be able to, yeah.
And I just extend it one more piece. Then what is the operating force? Because if I'm saying, okay, now I notice that I'm in this interaction, I haven't been able to hold on to myself, but I want to hold on to myself. But in holding on to myself, I'm going to realize the amount of closeness I'm going to let myself have with this person, or is it no longer?
Right. So I'm usually asking two questions. So again, let's say, right, we're with a patient who does really tend to completely lose touch with themselves when they're in close contact with someone else. And they realize that's a problem. And so they don't want to just see what they think you want and say it. They might have to break, give me a minute, and they might even close their eyes. Yeah, okay, so what I'm feeling now is, and then they might be able to open up and tell you, right? So it can be a stepwise. Now, the other question you asked is it healthy to be close to everyone? What would you say?
Well, no, but not.
No, of course not. So I often say to patients, Davilu talks about the wall, no wall. And I talk about a door, right? And I say, you want to have a door that you can open at will, right? And so you, Evelyn, okay, you've earned my trust. I want you in. You can come in. But you, Buster over there, forget it. Okay, I'm taking responsibility. I don't let in someone like you. Okay, so you want people to be able to make those choices, again, based on real data, not just I'm open to everybody or I don't trust anybody. Right, so I don't know if that answered your question.
Well,
but
I'm thinking, so when you're exploring that with a client, are you inviting them to notice their, like their feelings of trust or distrust as you say, okay, you're holding on to yourself? Is it then that you're going to the feelings piece or you're going to the thinking piece? Does that make sense?
It all depends. I mean, we would need a specific patient and scenario there to really be able to say something meaningful. Yeah. So thanks, Evelyn. I'm going to go on to Kara.
Yes.
Is it Kara? Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Unmute. Yeah. You're muted.
I'd like to ask you, how can I understand a situation where a 20 years old girl is coming to see me for a few months, more than half a year, and she can't talk about what happened. Once she did it, and then today she came and she said how she feels disgust in her throat. And every time she speaks, she's thinking about marriage or meeting boys or anything, the disgust comes in. And I ask her, how is it connected? And she says, yes, it's connected to that abuse long ago when she was 6 years old, and her brother, 10 years older, he raped her a few times, maybe 6, 7, 10 times. So. And we started to talk about the brother now in a different way, not just tell me what he did, which I did before because I wanted to know the facts, but how do you feel towards him for doing this to you?
Yes.
And she said, I feel pity for him. And I said, okay, is this pity a cover for something else maybe? Why pity? Because he went through so much, because he was abused himself.
You're asking her conscious mind, and that's not what you want. So you're asking what's your feeling toward him? She says, I feel pity for him. That's not a feeling toward him. That's saying, oh, I feel sorry for him. That's not a feeling toward him.
But
right.
what
So she's not answering your question. So by definition, it's a defense.
She says, I can't be angry at him. I can't feel the anger.
But anger comes to your mind. So you say, I can't.
Yes, anger came to her mind, right.
Exactly. So, but there's another thing I would say. So Davin really cautioned us not to try to go directly to primary attachment figures, because it's very difficult and they're going to defend those people, and she's protecting him. You want to go to the current trigger that's triggering that feeling in her throat. So is it when she's with a boyfriend, or, right? So you want to go for the recent trigger and go for the person in the current. And then as they're able to feel it toward someone in their current life, then it'll open up and get linked to the brother.
I did it. He hit her this week. This brother still lives at home. She's 30 now. And she's single and lives at home. He punched her for 4 times so hard that she was crying with pain.
Well, wait a minute. How does this happen? So this is right. She's 30 years old still.
He's 30. She's 20.
Okay.
Okay. And he punched her hard for just for her criticizing him. And then we started from how do you feel for him for punching you? And she said, I was disgusted, and I was a little angry. That was minimizing, but I was so disgusted. And I asked, how does disgust come in? Because he hit you and you felt pain. She says, I don't know, that disgust goes with me everywhere since he did it that time in childhood. But still, she's not ready to feel it.
Again, I mean, I can't really give you specific, I'd have to see the case and all that. But one thing that strikes me is, before I would even go to feelings, I mean, think about if she said some stranger came up to her and punched her in the face. Your first question is not going to be, how do you feel toward him? It's going to be, did you call the police? That's what I would ask her. You mean your brother assaulted you? Did you call the police? Right? And if not, and probably not, right, that's where you see so dramatically that she's willing to take abuse still, right? And not to hold him accountable and to protect him. And that is the problem. And she can't do that if she doesn't have access to her anger. Right? Right. And where was it, where was everybody else? But anyway, so if we can try to stay on the topic, I know it's hard, right, of working through, if there's anything else in particular that people either got from the book or had a question about. Kanwal.
Thank you, Patricia. Really appreciate your book. I'm midway through it, and I'm really loving it. And the thing that I'm most interested in is 2 things. One is rupture and repair, and even more than that is about termination, or saying goodbye, as you very beautifully put it in your book. And when is it that you would start to bring up termination, or would you bring it up, and or are you watching for, like, how are you watching for, like, okay, we are getting to termination? Obviously, one is where you place the person on the spectrum. That's one way in which, and then obviously their ability to experience feelings and have better relationships. But so that's one question. And the other is about the rupture and repair, because a lot of attention is given.
Let's take one at a time, okay? So,
thank you.
So for termination, again, from the beginning, right, when you're doing your trial therapy, you want to outline for yourself what are the problems, right? High unregulated anxiety, depression, tendency to be used and abused in relationships, right? So let's say those are the three. Then what's the goal going to be? When are you going to know it's time, right? That the person can, regulate their anxiety. In fact, they don't get so anxious about their feelings anymore. They're on friendly terms with them. The depression has been lifted. It's been replaced with hope and active engagement, right? And that whole pattern of being used and abused, right, is resolved. They can stand up for themselves and so on. So you know what your benchmark is, right? This is an ambitious treatment. We're going for, as Malin said, not just that symptoms and problems disappear, but they're actually replaced with something healthy. And you can see examples of a time when they would have, caved in to someone's demands. And they said, I'm going to say no here, right? You want that evidence. Typically, and this is something that I really never saw before ISTDP, right, is patients really feel proud of themselves. And there's kind of a celebratory aspect. And they'll say, gosh, like I remember this woman, she said, like, I'm a healthy person now. I mean, I feel like I don't need therapy anymore. And so they will often, at least a third of the time, according to research in ISTDP, they'll bring it up themselves. In other cases, they're going to hint, right, or they're going to tell you about all their successes, but not bring it up. So I'll say, wow, I mean, it sounds like you're saying, you're better, right? And, so what are your thoughts about that? Is there anything else you want to work on? Or, and then the whole issue of, loss, right? And again, depending on both their background, but how long you've been in treatment with them, right? How long termination would take, right? But yeah, if someone, it just comes in week after week with good report, right? And they're not talking, then you would bring it up. You'd say, it really seems like it's gotten resolved, right? So let's talk about ending, and then you'll see how they respond to that, right? And what else comes up for them. But many, many patients, if you think about it, that's why I call this chapter the good goodbye, because a lot of our patients don't have much experience with a good goodbye, right? Endings have always been traumatic. They've always been sad or a rupture, or right? And to actually say goodbye to someone that you feel good about, and someone where you're leaving not because there's a breakdown, right, but because you've graduated, right? So it's a new experience for many people.
Thank you.
And what was the question you had about rupture and repair?
Because rupture and repair, in other therapies is also given a lot of importance, and we don't talk about it as much in ISTDP, which is not right, because obviously there are many ruptures that we have to negotiate. And so I'm glad you mentioned it and that's given a chapter. And it does strike, and it comes at different times, the rupture. What has your experience been? I know you mentioned about the first patient or one of the first patients you had, where she comes back and says, like, you discharged me so quickly, and that can happen.
Right, she refused my repair attempts. Yes, that was very upsetting.
Yeah. So it's just that negotiating those repairs can be hard, and it can pull on. At least it pulls on me occasionally when it happens, and how to kind of get over it. How to
well, again, you're not trying to get over it. You really wanted to go through it, right? So first of all, we know from research, it's really up to the therapist to bring up the ruptures. Patients are very hesitant. They're terribly patient with us, and they might be hurt or angry, but they're not going to bring it up. So you have to be mindful and say, you seem unusually quiet today, right? Or you're much more subdued than usual. I wonder what's going on. Or you might yourself have thought about, geez, I think I was really off base the last time, right? So you might realize that you made an error. And so I think it's very important, and again, there's research to support this, that honestly acknowledging your error is very important. Don't just go to, like, the person will say, yeah, you've been late and I'm really getting frustrated. And you don't go immediately to the feeling. You first of all acknowledge that that's been happening, and then, right, and apologize and commit to doing it differently, right? And then you can go to the feelings, because too often it'll be clear that there's some kind of rupture and the therapist doesn't really acknowledge it, so they can almost deal with it as if the patient is projecting or something. They'll say, well, I said, but you did do that. Right? So why don't you better acknowledge it, right? And then, right, go to the feelings about it. Also, very often, like, what they made that mean. This is another thing I think we don't do enough of. Human beings are meaning-making machines. And so it's not just that they're angry, but they might make it mean, that you're not important and you really prefer other patients to them. And, and that's very connected to the fact that they were number 5 out of 7 kids who kind of got lost in the shuffle. So, these are all really wonderful opportunities, right, to, in the here and now, between the two of you, to bring up the feelings, the pathological beliefs, right? And then to facilitate actually a corrective experience from that rupture. It's not just repair, but actually have a correction, right? Where people will often say, well, no one's ever apologized to me. All right, I can't believe you actually, I thought you would get mad at me for bringing it up, right? But you're actually like welcoming that and apologizing. Wow, I've never had that experience, right? So often if you deal with it well, it ends up with the corrective experience, which is highly, highly associated with positive outcomes. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. So Yuval, it looks like our time is up.
Yeah, a good goodbye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this book and for all your contribution and the really honest and genuine way to do this work. It is so helpful. I really am connected to that. I am learning so much from you, and keep it real. Keep it real. Okay, there is really no other way actually, but especially when
but it's being taught another way, right? It's being taught in a very technical manner in many cases. And if I could just end with this, because it was very striking to me. It was the first session with someone who, had previous therapies before, including with someone I know who is, in fact, quite a harsh, critical person. And so when this patient came in, she kind of looked like a deer in the headlights. And I said, gee, how you feeling right now? And she said, anxious. And I said, what about? And she's like, yeah, I think it's, I'm worried about, because my last therapist was very critical, and so was my mother. And I said, oh, or something like that. She just looked at me and she said, oh my God. Yeah, I realize that's not going to happen with you. It was like, I was like, wait, what just happened? And she said, just the way you look at me. And you're really listening. And I could see your face and your tone of voice. She's like, I know you're not like them. Right. So there is, it's transference, but it's also real. Yeah. And so what kind of presence are you? How available are you for authentic connection? Or are you hiding behind, your technique? And, so I think that's very, very important with that. Who you are, as well as what you do, that matters.
Well, this is a good ending. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuval. And folks, if you have other questions or comments, you can put them on my YouTube channel and I'll respond. Okay? Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.